A passenger, accidentally, elbowed a black baby, but when the father stood up, everyone on that flight learned exactly who they were dealing with. He thought an elbow and a smirk would go unnoticed. He didn't realize the father sitting beside him carried authority that silence couldn't contain. Subscribe if you believe respect isn't optional, it's earned. The elbow struck before anyone could react. A sharp, hollow crack echoed through the cabin like the snap of breaking porcelain, followed by a baby's scream that sliced the tranquil hum of engines into ribbons. Dr. Adrian Corr jerked upright, his every nerve ignited. In his arms, little Noah twisted and wailed, his small jaw already swelling beneath the thin, delicate skin. The sound didn't stop, it rose, raw and piercing, filling the gold-lit cabin with something primal, pain, too innocent to ignore. Across the narrow armrest sat Brennan Vale, tall, pressed into a suit that tried and failed to civilize his impatience. His elbow hovered mid-air, the motion that caused the strike still frozen in disbelief or denial. "It was an accident," he muttered, but there was no urgency in his tone. Only irritation, as though the child's cries offended him more than his own carelessness. Adrian's breath caught somewhere between shock and instinct. Years in aerospace design had trained him to assess before acting, to isolate a fault before touching the controls. But this wasn't a machine. This was his son. The tremor in his hands betrayed the storm in his chest. "You just hit my child," he said quietly, his voice restrained but trembling with disbelief. Brennan's eyes flicked toward him with a faint smirk. "You should have held him tighter," he said. The words landed heavier than the strike itself, carrying the poison of arrogance that turns accidents into insults. Passengers nearby froze, some pretending not to see, others watching through half-lowered shades of politeness. The flight attendant hesitated 2 rows away, her tray trembling. "Sir, is everything all right?" she asked, but the words came out small, as if afraid to disturb the social order. Adrian didn't answer immediately. He was looking at Noah, his small chest heaving, his cries hiccuping between breaths. When Adrian gently touched his son's jaw, the baby flinched, and a faint purple bruise had already begun to bloom. Something inside him shifted, a slow, deep movement like tectonic plates beneath calm seas. His mind began cataloging details unconsciously: the trajectory of Brennan's elbow, the angle of impact, the degree of swelling. The analytical part of him, the engineer, refused to turn off, even as the father in him burned. "Please," Adrian said softly to the attendant, "I need a medical kit." Cold compress, gauze, anything. The attendant looked uncertain. "I'll check with the lead." "Now," Adrian interrupted, not raising his voice but leaving no room for hesitation. Brennan leaned back in his seat, crossing one leg over the other. "You're overreacting," he muttered, swirling the ice in his untouched drink. "Kids cry. That's what they do." The man's indifference wrapped around the moment like smoke. Adrian's jaw clenched, but his composure remained intact. His thoughts sharpened, focusing not on vengeance but on precision. "He's not crying because he's upset," he said, meeting Brennan's eyes. "He's crying because you fractured his jaw." Brennan laughed once, a short, mirthless sound. "You can't know that." Adrian's voice lowered to a near whisper. "I build aircraft that detect structural cracks invisible to the human eye. I know fractures when I see them." The air thickened. The engines roared steady, but inside the cabin, silence pressed in, a silence that carried judgment. A few rows back, a man cleared his throat, uneasy. Someone muttered something about calling the crew supervisor. Noah whimpered, his tiny fingers gripping his father's collar. The sound shredded the last layer of restraint holding Adrian still. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate, careful not to jostle the child. The motion drew the attention of every nearby passenger. Brennan looked up, expecting rage. What he found instead was something worse: control. Adrian leaned slightly forward, his voice calm, steady. "You need to look at him," he said. "You need to understand what you just did." Brennan turned away. "I said it was an accident." "And I said," Adrian murmured, "you broke my son's jaw." The attendant returned, flustered, holding a small first-aid pouch. "Sir, please, try to stay calm," she said, but even she couldn't keep her hands from shaking as she passed him the kit. Adrian took it, nodding once, the measured precision of his gestures a quiet defiance against chaos. He held the compress against Noah's jaw, whispering words meant only for the boy. "It's okay, little one. I've got you. I promise. You're safe." But beneath those words lived another voice, a memory of his wife's last words before the accident that had taken her. "Promise me, if anything happens, you protect him. Not just his body, his dignity." He looked back at Brennan, who was pretending to scroll through his phone, oblivious or unwilling to face the damage done. Adrian saw something flicker, a faint trace of unease in the man's reflection on the cabin window. It wasn't guilt, it was fear, though Brennan didn't yet understand why. The captain's announcement broke briefly through the cabin speakers. Routine turbulence, nothing to worry about, but the vibration in the air told a different story. Adrian could feel more than just mechanical instability. There was something human about this imbalance, something deliberate. He adjusted his seatbelt, his gaze lingering on the name tag of the approaching flight attendant who replaced the last one, Darren Vale. The coincidence was small, almost forgettable, yet it etched itself into Adrian's thoughts like a warning sign carved into metal. "Would you like me to take a statement, sir?" Darren asked. "Too polite? Too rehearsed?" "Not yet," Adrian replied, eyes never leaving Brennan. The businessman exhaled through his nose, trying to reclaim dominance with a lazy smirk. "Look, don't make this a scene. It was a mistake. You engineers, always looking for problems to fix." Adrian's expression didn't change, but the faintest edge of a smile ghosted across his lips, cold and exact. "Sometimes the problems fix themselves," he said. Outside, the Atlantic stretched endlessly, silver under moonlight. Inside, the cabin had become a fragile equation, anger held in perfect balance against reason. Everyone felt it, that this wasn't just a misunderstanding between passengers. It was the start of something larger, the first spark in a pressurized space. Brennan turned away, dismissive, but the unease in his shoulders betrayed him. The rhythmic hum of the engines filled the silence, and Noah's cries softened into small, sleepy breaths against his father's chest. Adrian looked down at him, tracing the bruise with eyes that promised not vengeance, but justice measured in truth. He sat back slowly, holding his son close, gaze fixed forward, not on the man beside him, but on something unseen beyond the cabin walls. The gold light caught the reflection of his face in the window. Calm, calculating, resolved. The passengers around them exchanged glances, uncertain whether the storm had passed or merely paused. But Adrian knew. The turbulence inside him had only begun to rise. The silence that followed wasn't just shock, it was the birth of fury too deep for words. The man everyone thought was quiet had just been handed his reason to rise. Adrian's voice cut through the heavy silence. "I need medical aid now." His words were measured, but the weight behind them made even the passengers in the back rows glance up. He cradled Noah closer, shielding the child's bruised jaw from the dim cabin light. The infant's cries had faded to weak whimpers, but each sound twisted something deeper in Adrian's chest. He wasn't just a father in distress, he was a man trained to see patterns, to read systems, and what he saw now was not incompetence, but intention. Instead of responding with urgency, the crew hesitated. Two attendants exchanged uncertain glances near the galley. The senior among them, a tall, clean-cut man with clipped speech, stepped forward. His name tag read Darren Vale, and his face bore the unmistakable resemblance to the man who'd caused the injury. "Sir, please lower your voice," Darren said, his tone wrapped in artificial politeness. It was an accident. Adrian stared at him, stunned that the man could deliver such a line with no trace of remorse. The words didn't just sting, they clarified something. He felt his pulse rise, not from panic, but from calculation. Brennan's expression hadn't shown guilt, and now Darren was reciting policy like it was armor. "I'm asking for a first aid kit," Adrian said firmly, adjusting Noah gently in his arms. "That's not a request, it's a right." "I'm afraid we can't allow movement right now," Darren replied, placing one hand on the bulkhead as if bracing himself for turbulence that hadn't yet returned. "The seatbelt sign is on. Cabin movement is restricted during atmospheric instability." Adrian's brow furrowed. "So, turbulence lets a grown man crush a baby's face, but stops you from handing me gauze." The corner of Darren's mouth twitched, not quite a smirk, but close. His voice stayed low. "Let's not escalate the situation." Adrian's breath caught, not because of fear, but because the veil had dropped. There was something more beneath this. The look in Darren's eyes wasn't fear of protocol, but fear of exposure. Behind him, Brennan muttered under his breath, "Don't let him make a scene." That whisper wasn't just careless, it was calculated. Adrian caught the shift in Darren's stance. It wasn't the reaction of a concerned attendant, but of someone suddenly reminded of an objective. Darren gave a small nod toward a man seated 2 rows back. The contractor, Adrian had noticed him earlier at the gate, dressed in civilian clothes but with that unmistakable posture. Squared shoulders, earpiece tucked just behind the collar, eyes that scanned without pausing. He had brushed too closely past Adrian during boarding, just long enough to inspect his ring. At the time, it had felt odd. Now, it felt like the start of something deliberate. Adrian's mind reeled, not from panic, but focus. A memory surfaced. Last winter's expo in Geneva, where he'd unveiled his prototype for compression-reactive biomaterials, technology designed to interface with biometric feedback, storing critical data within layers of reactive filament. A defense contractor had tried to buy the patent. When Adrian refused, the offer turned into a threat. That contractor? ARV Systems. Was it possible this wasn't about a bruised baby, but a stolen breakthrough? His grip on Noah tightened slightly, protective and steady. The boy's eyelids fluttered, his breath hitching through the pain. Adrian brushed his fingers softly against the side of Noah's face, whispering, "I've got you, son." But his eyes remained locked on Darren, who had taken a subtle half-step back as if trying to appear neutral. Passengers began to murmur again. A man near the window slowly angled his phone, pretending to check a message while recording. Another, mid-30s, beard, business jacket, had his phone face down but lens up. They saw what was happening. Not all would speak up, but some were watching now, waiting to see who broke the tension first. Adrian's engineering instincts kicked in. He scanned the ceiling panels overhead, the placement of service ports, the locations of cabin microphones, the slight bulge where a camera was embedded near the lavatory door. He knew these systems. He'd built better ones. He didn't need force, he needed truth, and truth always left a trace. His eyes settled on the contractor, who had turned slightly, one hand resting on his hip, not near a weapon, but near a case. Probably biometric capture gear, something that could scan his ring, extract data without consent under the guise of safety detention. This was not a flight delay. This was a trap. Adrian turned his full attention back to Darren. "You've made a mistake," he said, his voice now calm, low, dangerous. "You think this is about cabin protocol." It's not. Darren swallowed, lips parting as if to respond, but nothing came. "You're not protecting passengers," Adrian continued. "You're protecting a plan. But here's the thing about plans. They're only as strong as the lies they're built on." Brennan scoffed, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "You sound paranoid. Accidents happen. Maybe hold your kid tighter next time Adrian didn't look at him." He just said, without blinking, You broke his jaw." Brennan shrugged. "And you're still talking?" The silence that followed was colder than any turbulence. Adrian didn't shout. He didn't raise a fist. Instead, he looked slowly from Brennan to Darren, then to the security contractor now pretending to yawn. "If you're going to lie," Adrian said, "make sure my son can't prove it later." Darren's face twitched. Not anger, not confusion, something closer to fear. For the first time, the performance cracked. He had just realized what his brother hadn't, that the man they were trying to corner wasn't only a father, but an engineer who once built defense systems that remembered every signal, every movement, and every betrayal. He didn't realize the man holding the baby had built machines that never forgot. Curtains slid shut with a faint metallic whisper, sealing off the first-class cabin from the rest of the plane. The sudden partition felt less like comfort and more like containment. The cabin crew moved with nervous purpose, casting glances that didn't linger and offering reassurances that didn't land. Adrian Corr remained still, his arms securely wrapped around his son. Noah whimpered softly, a fragile sound that broke Adrian's concentration for the briefest moment. He adjusted the cloth pressed against the infant's swelling jaw, rage curling beneath the calm exterior he'd mastered long ago. Darren Vale, the lead attendant, stood just feet away. His voice was low and rehearsed. "This is just to keep the area calm, sir," he said, gesturing toward the curtains. Adrian didn't look at him. "Or to keep eyes off what you don't want seen," he murmured almost to himself. Brennan Vale, now slouched arrogantly in 2B, scoffed and waved a dismissive hand. "People get bumped all the time in turbulence. Don't make this bigger than it is." Adrian's eyes flicked upward. The cabin ceiling, to most, was a patchwork of white panels and air vents. To him, it was a blueprint. Years in aerospace design had given him the ability to see what others couldn't, where the cameras were, how the emergency intercom wiring ran, which panels housed manual overrides. He scanned silently, filing away possibilities like a chess player mapping his next dozen moves. He stood, calmly, firmly. "If any of you are filming," he said to the passengers nearby, his voice firm but unshaken, "don't stop now." Two men in the middle rows, caught between confusion and concern, hesitated. One held up a phone uncertainly. Darren reacted quickly, stepping forward with a hand raised. "Sir, we'll have to ask you to stop recording." "This is for everyone's safety," Adrian stepped in, placing himself squarely between Darren and the passenger. His presence was quiet but commanding, like a man used to rooms full of generals and engineers. "Transparency protects everyone," he said, his tone carrying the weight of unspoken warning. Behind him, Brennan muttered something under his breath and rolled his eyes, still nursing a drink. But Adrian's attention was drawn to something far more dangerous, a shift in the body language of the nearby security contractor. The man, bulky with a plain blazer and a face too stern to be inconspicuous, had positioned himself by the emergency exit row. His hand slid deliberately inside his jacket. Adrian's gaze narrowed. That movement wasn't idle. It wasn't instinctive. It was the kind of gesture meant to test timing, to verify reach. The man wasn't reaching for a standard weapon either. The posture was too shallow, the grip too gentle. It was something lighter. Adrian's mind filtered possibilities like code, non-lethal, close range, concealed. A tranquilizer injector. He'd seen such devices during presentations to defense clients. Designed for detainment without visible harm. They didn't just sedate. Some could be outfitted with biometric readers scanning for encrypted data signatures on contact. If the man was ARV and this whole charade was a cover for corporate theft, then the elbow to Noah's jaw wasn't just cruelty. It was a calculated trigger. His jaw tightened. He cradled Noah closer, whispering reassurance that was meant as much for himself as for his son. "You're okay, son. You're okay." His thumb brushed gently along the baby's temple, just beneath the flushed swelling. From the corner of his eye, he noticed another detail, a faint green light blinking against Brennan's wristwatch. The model wasn't commercial. It was a modified prototype from a corporate line Adrian had once consulted for. It synced to encrypted environments. It had to. That watch was part of the data capture system. Everything around him clicked into place like the locking clamps of an engine housing. The flight reroute, the staged turbulence, the delayed medical attention. This wasn't a reaction. It was an operation. He was the target. Noah was the leverage. Adrian's pulse steadied. His mind began assembling contingencies. He mapped the location of emergency levers, manual oxygen valve access, even the least reinforced section of the galley wall. His thoughts split into layers, one focused on survival, one on sabotage, one on escape. They'd cornered the wrong man. Brennan leaned back in his seat, legs stretched casually. He sneered. "You engineers always think too much." Adrian turned to face him fully, expression blank but eyes burning with clarity. The cabin lights cast long shadows across the curve of his cheek as he stepped into the aisle, shielding his son with his shoulder. His voice came out like metal striking stone. "And we always finish what others start." The captain's voice came over the intercom with a strained politeness. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a pocket of unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts securely fastened." The cabin lights dimmed slightly as if to reinforce the command, and a low chime followed. But Adrian Corr didn't buy it. From his seat in 2A, he subtly adjusted the smart ring on his right hand, brushing the side of the metallic band against the fabric of his trousers as if out of habit. In reality, he was activating the embedded diagnostic ping, a function used in test flights to analyze system integrity. A second later, a tiny vibration returned. The aircraft's system data wasn't just scrambled, it was being actively obscured. The response was irregular, fragmented. Someone was overriding logs. His gaze remained steady, calm on the surface. To anyone watching, he looked like a man silently tending to a sleeping baby. But inside, his mind was shifting gears from parental concern to tactical execution. Something was wrong, not just morally but mechanically. He glanced toward Brennan Vale. The man sat sideways in his seat, drink in hand, posture loose but too rehearsed, as if trying too hard to appear casual. Brennan's fingers kept brushing the bezel of his sleek, matte black watch, a model Adrian instantly recognized as a secure corporate issue, capable of encrypted transmissions. Brennan wasn't a jittery traveler. He was monitoring something. A few feet away, Darren Vale stood stiffly at the galley divider, arms crossed, watching the cabin like a low-level manager unsure of his orders. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Adrian noticed the subtle earpiece coiled at the edge of Darren's collar, mostly hidden beneath his neckline. This wasn't just an unruly passenger incident anymore. This was a containment protocol, one that had been rehearsed. Adrian's thoughts snapped back to an industry event nearly a year ago, a technology summit in Geneva, where executives from ARV Systems had approached him with high offers to license his biometric compression algorithm, technology that enabled data to be embedded within flexible surfaces like clothing, or, more precisely, accessories like rings. He had refused. Twice. The last message from them hadn't been a proposal. It had been a warning. And now, here he was, rerouted in the sky with an injured child in his arms, and the same corporation shadows looming 2 seats away. He adjusted Noah gently, cradling the boy's swollen jaw with practiced care. The infant whimpered, but didn't wake. Adrian reached for the soft cloth he'd used earlier to keep Noah calm and pressed it lightly along the side of his son's cheek. The motion masked a deeper action. He tapped twice on the inner face of his ring, triggering an emergency transmission to his lab's off-site backup drive. If anything happened to him, the ring would release all stored diagnostic and biometric telemetry from the aircraft to a secure server. The story would not die in the clouds. His eyes scanned the cabin again. To the left, a balding man in his 50s sat near the bulkhead, scrolling nervously through his phone. Adrian leaned subtly toward him during the next bout of turbulence, keeping his voice low. "If the seatbelt sign flashes twice," Adrian murmured, "record everything you see. Don't stop. Understand?" The man blinked, surprised, but gave a tight nod. Adrian leaned back in his seat, shifting Noah gently in his lap. The boy stirred slightly, breathing steady. Adrian closed his eyes for a breath, not out of fatigue, but focus. Every instinct from his years in aerospace development sharpened into one point: containment. That's what they wanted. To corner him, strip him of authority under the pretense of safety, extract the ring and suppress the evidence. The elbow to Noah's face had been the trigger, not a mistake, but a message. He opened his eyes again. Darren still lingered near the aisle, posture unchanged, but the subtle clench in his jaw betrayed stress. Adrian didn't need a confession to confirm what he already knew. The trap had been set long before he boarded. He glanced down again. Noah's pacifier had fallen to the floor, rolling slightly beneath the seat. Adrian reached for it and paused mid-motion, beneath Brennan's seat. Something metallic glinted dully. It wasn't a typical carry-on. He glimpsed a corner of a hard case, military-grade, reinforced, with a discreet serial tag etched into its corner. He saw the initials engraved near the lock: A.R.V. His breath slowed. They hadn't just boarded to harass him, they were mid-extraction. The entire setup was built around proximity. The ring, encoded with Adrian's proprietary compression software, could only be accessed under a specific biometric handshake. If they could get close enough, under the ruse of an incident, they could extract the core sequence in flight. Before anyone ever questioned why a father was detained over safety concerns, he retrieved the pacifier and tucked it back into Noah's blanket, keeping his head low. His fingers brushed the ring once more, this time initializing a local failsafe. It sent a pulse, a non-lethal electromagnetic disruption calibrated to scramble unverified readers within 10 feet. It wouldn't be noticeable unless someone was running a scan. From the corner of his eye, he saw Brennan jolt slightly and looked down at his watch. A red light blinked once before vanishing. Across the aisle, Darren tapped the earpiece and frowned. Adrian had just short-circuited their play. He didn't speak, didn't gloat. He simply adjusted Noah's position and folded the blanket higher over the boy's chest. Then he looked up, first at Brennan, then at Darren. He didn't blink. They didn't smile. No one in that cabin realized the man sitting in 2A had built the very diagnostic systems now working against them. "They hurt you to bait me," he murmured, voice barely audible. "They'll regret not checking who was holding the blueprints to their own destruction." The cabin jolted sharply, a hard drop that rattled the overhead bins and made the light fixtures pulse erratically. Passengers gasped and gripped their armrests, but Adrian Corr didn't flinch. His eyes were fixed on the faint glimmer beneath seat 2B, a metallic edge just barely visible in the dim glow. Another tremor passed through the aircraft, more deliberate than natural. Adrian's instincts sharpened. He shifted Noah gently into a more secure position against his chest and leaned forward, pressing one hand to the floor as though stabilizing himself. His fingers brushed the floor, steady, unhurried. He bent at the knee, pretending to tie his shoe with calculated precision. That's when he saw it in full, a matte black case no larger than a lunchbox, fitted with a biometric lock and a cold blue LED blinking once every 3 seconds. The insignia embossed on the corner, ARV Systems, his former subcontractor. His breath caught. Months ago, they'd courted him with lucrative offers to purchase his biometric compression algorithm, a technology that could reshape structural integrity for everything from cockpits to cryo units. When he refused, their last message had been a veiled threat masked in politeness. "We'll obtain it by any means necessary." He'd dismissed it then. Now he was staring at the means. Adrian rose slowly, adjusting Noah's blanket. The baby whimpered softly, his jaw swollen, his breath uneven. Adrian's free hand dropped to his lap, fingers brushing the polished edge of his smart ring. He tapped a precise pattern against it. 3 short pulses, 2 long. Beneath the plane's floor, a failsafe signal activated. A soft, invisible hum traveled through the cabin, pulsing outward like a silent sonar. Adrian knew the signal would do exactly what he'd designed it to: scramble any unauthorized biometric scanners within a 10-foot radius. It was a field prototype, never officially approved, but he hadn't dismantled it when he left ARV. Some things were meant to protect more than just data. 2 rows ahead, Darren Vale stiffened. The tablet in his hand flickered, then displayed a series of errors in red font. Signal jammed. Device unresponsive. He tapped the screen again, confusion washing over his face like a man watching a storm roll in from an open field. Brennan turned subtly toward his brother. "What's wrong?" he muttered, his voice low but sharp. Darren glanced around, scanning for clues. "Something's interfering with the reader." Adrian stood, his silhouette steady against the flickering overhead light. He held Noah closer, voice measured, deliberate. "What's wrong," he said quietly, "is thinking you can wound a man's child and still walk off this plane untouched." Brennan leaned back in his seat, clearly startled by the calm intensity in Adrian's voice. "We told you it was turbulence." "An accident. Is that what ARV told you to call it?" Adrian replied, his gaze now locked on Brennan's wristwatch, a corporate model with a hidden uplink, most likely used to trigger transfers. Brennan flinched ever so slightly. The mask of innocence cracked. From across the aisle, a passenger coughed and shifted nervously. Others were watching now, recording even. The tension in the air thickened like pressurized steam. Darren stepped forward, trying to reassert command. "Sir, please sit down. You're escalating a situation that doesn't exist." "Oh, it exists," Adrian said, angling himself slightly so that his back was no longer exposed to the aisle. "But it's not the one you described." His voice was soft, almost too calm. It cut through the background noise like a scalpel, drawing blood with precision. He glanced down at Noah again. His son's lip trembled as he slept, his face bruised and puffy. A surge of emotion swept through Adrian, but he didn't let it show. Control was his greatest strength. The case beneath 2B blinked again. The green light was still pulsing. That meant the uplink hadn't completed. They hadn't gotten what they came for. Not yet. Adrian's mind moved like a turbine, calculating, assessing. If they had planned a mid-flight extraction, they needed time, control, and silence. The turbulence was no coincidence. It was a smokescreen, and now that smoke was lifting. He stepped sideways toward the aisle, eyes tracking Darren's every move. The younger Vale's hands were fidgeting now, no longer the calm professional. His performance was unraveling. "You brought a scanner on board," Adrian said aloud for others to hear. "Tried to provoke a response, isolate me and run the extraction under the guise of detainment." "That's absurd," Brennan snapped, rising slightly. "You're paranoid." "No," Adrian said, steady. "I'm prepared." He tapped the ring again, another silent signal. He watched Darren's tablet blink once more and then go dark completely. Somewhere below the cabin, the failsafe began a second wave. Proximity sweep and signal blockade. Any attempt to offload data from the biometric lockbox would fail now. Darren's expression fell. He knew. The plan was collapsing. Brennan looked between them, then hissed under his breath, "This isn't over." Adrian stepped forward, just enough to let his words be heard by the front 3 rows. "You're right. It's not, but it's no longer in your hands." Passengers began to murmur again. One man angled his phone slightly higher, recording without blinking. Darren looked at his brother. "We need to go to Plan 2. But Adrian cut in, voice sharp enough to silence the cabin. "There's no Plan 2. Not after you hurt my son." He bent down again, not to tie his shoe this time, but to reach directly under 2B. He touched the case, just long enough to trigger its magnetic lock without opening it. His ring sent a localized jamming pulse, permanently disabling the uplink inside. The green light died. No beeps, no alarms, just quiet defeat. When he stood again, he looked Brennan straight in the eye. "You came for what I built," he said. "Instead, you just triggered what I protected." Brennan opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Around them, the plane seemed to settle, but inside Adrian, a fire had ignited. He held Noah closer, pressing his lips to the boy's forehead. Everything inside that cabin was about to shift, from turbulence to reckoning. The plane steadied after a brief jolt of turbulence, the soft hum of the engines filling the tense silence. Darren's voice rose over the intercom, sharp and authoritative. "Everyone, please remain seated until further notice." His tone carried the brittle edge of control barely maintained. Passengers obeyed, glancing nervously at the front of the cabin where Adrian sat rigid in seat 2A, his infant son resting against his shoulder. The air felt heavier than it had minutes ago, thick with the kind of stillness that came before something inevitable. Adrian's gaze didn't drift toward the window or the flight attendants. It locked onto a small flash of metal under the jacket of the contractor standing near the galley. The man's hand shifted slightly, revealing the smooth black cylinder clipped inside his vest. It wasn't a gun, Adrian realized. It was something far more deliberate. The design was unmistakable, a proximity-based biometric reader disguised as a tranquilizer injector. He'd seen one years ago during a classified defense demonstration, capable of extracting encrypted data from micro-integrated wearables. The realization sent a controlled wave of anger through him. They didn't want his life. They wanted his ring. The ring, the very same one he'd designed for secure engineering environments, held compressed data worth billions. His mind raced through the implications. ARV Systems had found a way to bring the theft to him mid-air, hidden beneath the guise of a simple altercation. They'd orchestrated this. They'd broken his son's jaw to push him into compliance. He inhaled slowly, steadying his heartbeat to match the drone of the engines. Panic would serve them. Control would destroy them. "Stay calm," he murmured under his breath, pretending to comfort Noah as he rocked him gently. The baby whimpered softly, his small hand gripping his father's collar. The sound of it, pure, fragile pain, nearly shattered Adrian's restraint, but he kept his face neutral. Brennan leaned back in his seat, trying to appear casual but unable to hide the quick flick of his eyes toward Darren and the contractor. His right hand slid over the metallic briefcase by his feet, the faint click of a latch opening masked by the hum of the air vents. Adrian caught it, the green light blinking inside, a soft pulse like a heartbeat. Transmission ready. He understood instantly. The device in the case was primed to capture his ring signal once the biometric extractor was close enough. Adrian's gaze shifted toward the galley. Behind the beverage counter, half concealed by a narrow metallic panel, he spotted the secondary access port. He knew that layout intimately. He'd helped design it during an earlier engineering contract. It connected directly to the aircraft's auxiliary system, capable of rerouting internal communications. If he could reach it, he could sever whatever external signal Brennan's device was trying to transmit. But getting there meant moving, and moving meant risk. He leaned back, letting his shoulders relax, projecting exhaustion. "I'm going to calm my son," he said quietly, his tone steady but low enough to mask the intention behind the words. Darren turned sharply, his jaw tightening. "Sir, please stay seated," he ordered, his voice rehearsed and hollow. The authority in it rang false, as though borrowed from someone else's script. Brennan didn't even look up from his tablet. "Let him go," he muttered, waving his hand lazily. He's not going anywhere." His dismissiveness was arrogance distilled. He thought Adrian was broken, cornered. Adrian rose slowly, keeping Noah close, his every movement deliberate. He let his eyes flick to the other passengers. Most were silent, watching but afraid to intervene. A few whispered, unsure whether they were witnessing a disturbance or something far more calculated. He caught the contractor's reflection in the polished surface of the galley door. The man's eyes followed his every step. When Adrian reached the narrow corridor near the beverage counter, the hum of the engines grew louder, vibrating through the floor. The metallic scent of pressurized air filled his nostrils, mingling with the faint aroma of burnt coffee from earlier service. He lowered Noah gently into the bassinet fixed to the wall, whispering, "You're safe here." Just for a moment, the child's eyes fluttered half open, his small fingers curling instinctively. Adrian turned his attention to the panel. His mind switched fully into engineer mode, every movement now mechanical precision. He reached for the edge of the counter, prying loose the corner of the access plate with the beveled edge of his ring. A soft, metallic snap echoed. Beneath it lay a bundle of fiber-optic cables, their colored sheaths pulsing faint light. He identified the secondary communication line instantly, the one not visible to the crew. Behind him, the faint shuffle of shoes. Darren was watching, perhaps suspecting something. Adrian kept his back turned and said calmly, "Just getting ice for my son's bruise." His voice carried enough weariness to sound plausible. He reconnected one cable with a subtle twist of his ring's embedded node. The small pulse of current that traveled through it was invisible to anyone but him. The signal route changed, rerouting the feed away from the aircraft's internal network. He replaced the panel smoothly, closing it as Darren's reflection appeared beside him. "You're not authorized to," Darren began, but Adrian interrupted softly. "You don't want to finish that sentence." His tone wasn't angry, it was final. Something in the stillness of his posture made Darren step back. When Adrian returned to his seat, Noah now resting quietly against his chest, Brennan was still pretending to browse his tablet. The contractor, however, looked uneasy. His brow furrowed as he checked a small monitor on his wrist. "Signal interference," he muttered under his breath. Brennan frowned. "What do you mean, interference?" "The transmission's fluctuating," the man replied, tapping the device again. His discomfort was visible now, sweat gathering at his temple. Adrian looked up, meeting Brennan's eyes. The calmness there unnerved the man. "What did you do?" Brennan demanded. Adrian adjusted the ice pack on Noah's face with deliberate care. "I fixed what you broke," he said simply. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Even the hum of the engine sounded distant, as if the air itself was waiting. Darren stepped forward, his expression torn between confusion and authority. He reached out as though to seize Adrian's shoulder, but the faint vibration through the floor stopped him, a sound only Adrian recognized. Far below, in the cargo hold, a low mechanical thud reverberated through the fuselage. It was steady, rhythmic, an activation code. Ranger, his retired K-9 service dog, had been placed in cargo for the flight. Trained years ago under Adrian's command, the dog's neural implant could detect specific frequencies emitted by his ring. It meant one thing: standby mode disengaged. Brennan's color drained as the realization dawned. You brought that thing on board," he hissed, voice trembling. Adrian's gaze didn't waver. "You trained a machine to obey commands," Brennan whispered, panic edging his tone. "Paling." Adrian corrected him, his voice soft but cutting through the silence like a blade. "No, I trained it to protect truth." The hum beneath them deepened, the engine steady once more, but the balance of power inside the cabin had shifted. The storm was no longer outside the plane, it was seated quietly in 2A, holding a sleeping child and a secret they could no longer control. "You can't contain a man who built the walls you're hiding behind," Adrian reached the galley under the pretense of fetching ice for Noah's bruise, his voice even, his steps deliberate. The flight attendant stationed near the curtain gave a half-hearted nod as Adrian passed, his gaze barely lifting from a checklist. The overhead lighting flickered again, momentary, but timed too closely to the last pulse of turbulence. Adrian's heartbeat measured each second like a metronome, his mind sinking to the rhythm of threat. The door clicked shut behind him with a faint mechanical sigh. He took a breath, not deep, not loud, just centered. Noah stirred in his arms. The infant's face, swollen and tear-streaked, was a silent reminder of what had been done, and why this couldn't end with apologies. Adrian spotted the crew bassinet mounted along the side wall, standard issue, secured with dual latches, and laid Noah gently inside. His palm lingered on the child's chest, feeling the fragile rise and fall beneath his small sleeping shirt. "Hold on, little one," he whispered. With Noah safe, the engineer emerged. He moved fast, efficient, purposeful, a man back in his element, where design met execution. Sliding to the rear corner of the galley, he crouched and ran his finger beneath the base of a stainless steel panel, one he had once recommended in his consulting years for ease of access. He found the seam. The hidden groove responded to the micro-edge of his ring, custom-engineered, unassuming in design but keyed to his biometric signature. The panel gave way with a soft click. Behind it, cables and ports lined the interior wall, mostly for maintenance diagnostics, unused by regular crew. His target, the auxiliary network access. He plugged the ring into the thin, amber port. A subtle vibration confirmed handshake. The embedded encryption script he'd written months ago, a contingency for sabotage he hoped he'd never need, initialized. It was a loop-back override, one that rerouted the cabin's internal feed through a dummy node and mirrored it directly to his private off-site drive. Cameras, audio, sensor readouts, all of it. Now, everything happening in the aircraft was no longer under airline control. It was under his. He removed the ring, restored the panel, and took one last glance at Noah before stepping back into the aisle. No alarms, no questions. Darren stood 3 feet away, facing the curtain, arms crossed. His brow furrowed slightly as Adrian approached. The older man extended his hand. "Ice, please," Adrian said with calculated calm. Darren hesitated, eyes flicking toward the galley. He seemed to consider questioning Adrian's absence, but thought better of it. Reaching into a drawer, he retrieved a sealed bag of ice and placed it gently into Adrian's outstretched hand. Adrian gave a curt nod and returned to his seat without another word. As he eased down beside Noah and laid the ice carefully against the bruised cheek, his peripheral vision caught a flicker on Brennan's tablet. A blinking light. Then another. Brennan looked up sharply, lips tightening. His fingers moved over the screen as if trying to diagnose the interference. His eyes found Adrian's across the aisle. "What did you do?" Brennan asked, the edge in his voice no longer veiled. Adrian didn't flinch. "I fixed what you broke," he replied. The moment hung, pregnant with unspoken threat. Darren reacted. His hand shot out toward Adrian, fingers curling to seize his arm, to reassert control. But the second his foot shifted, a sudden thud echoed faintly through the floor. A metallic jolt, like something heavy had snapped out of place in cargo. Brennan froze. So did Darren. From the underbelly of the aircraft came another sound, lower, more rhythmic. Claws against crate, footfalls, then silence. Adrian didn't need to explain. Ranger had received the signal. Years ago, during a private contract with Tactical Response Divisions, Adrian had worked closely with military K-9 programs. Ranger had been part of those early iterations, loyal, precise, imprinted with a range of conditional commands via acoustic triggers. The tone embedded in his ring, inaudible to most but perfectly tuned for Ranger, had activated one of those commands. Brennan's complexion lost color. "You trained a machine to obey commands," he said, voice barely above a whisper, almost reverent in its disbelief. Adrian turned toward him, eyes like steel wrapped in calm. "No," he said. "I trained it to protect truth." He brushed off his cruelty with a fake apology, mocking the family as the cabin turned tense. If you believe arrogance always folds under truth, hit subscribe now. Because justice doesn't shout, it stands tall. The cabin erupted. The turbulence, or was it deliberate interference from Adrian's override, shook the aircraft with a force that sent glasses clattering and overhead bins creaking open. A chorus of startled gasps filled the first-class cabin. Lights blinked erratically, and somewhere near the rear, a service tray overturned, its contents crashing to the floor. But Adrian Corr wasn't watching the chaos around him. His eyes were locked on the contractor. The man moved. In a single motion, the bulky figure lunged from his jump seat, pulling a sleek black device from under his jacket, a scanner cleverly disguised as a tranquilizer gun. It was built for rapid biometric extraction. Adrian had seen one like it years ago during a defense expo in Berlin. He remembered how a presenter had bragged it could extract encrypted data from wearable tech before the subject even realized it. Not today. Adrian dropped low, pivoting on his heel. The contractor's swing sailed over his head. In the next instant, Adrian surged upward, planting his elbow hard into the man's ribs. A sharp grunt escaped the contractor's lips as he staggered backward, crashing against the armrests and tumbling into the aisle. The forceful impact drew startled cries from passengers now rising from their seats. Brennan Vale shot to his feet, his drink spilling across the seat cushion. His voice was sharp, panicked. "Darren, get him down, now!" Adrian turned just in time to block the flight attendant's arm, Darren's hand reaching toward him with a security strap. With a smooth reflex born of years handling high-pressure environments, Adrian grabbed a nearby serving tray and raised it like a shield. The strap snapped against the metal with a harsh clang. "Noah's watching," Adrian reminded himself silently. His grip tightened, the weight of his son against his left arm grounding him. Passengers fumbled with their phones, some recording openly now. The chaos had drawn them in fully. No one could pretend this was normal anymore. The contractor groaned as he pushed himself off the floor. Adrian knew he'd try again. But this time, Adrian was already moving. His eyes locked on the metallic case under seat 2B, the one Brennan had so carefully shielded throughout the flight. A flick of the foot, a twist of the wrist, and the case was in Adrian's grasp. As he rose to full height, he flipped the lid open and turned toward the crowd. Inside, embedded in velvet casing, was a small biometric interface pulsing with green light, active, operational, and unmistakably marked with the insignia of ARV Systems. Adrian's voice cut through the madness. "You're stealing technology mid-flight," he declared, loud and unflinching, "and you called this an accident." Gasps spread through the cabin like electricity. The flashing cabin lights gave the ARV insignia an eerie gleam, almost glowing in the confined space. Brennan lunged forward, aiming for the case, but Adrian sidestepped and slammed it hard onto the floor. The crack of metal and circuitry filled the air, followed by a fizz of sparks as the internal scanner sputtered and died. The device was ruined. Sparks danced like fireflies near Brennan's polished shoes. He froze, arms half raised in disbelief. For the first time, he looked genuinely afraid. Darren stood still, trapped between instinct and loyalty. His fingers hovered near the emergency panel, his eyes darting between his brother and Adrian. "This isn't what we were told," he shouted, his voice cracking. Adrian's eyes narrowed. He could feel the cabin watching. Not just the passengers, but the crew, the air, the walls. Truth was no longer a private burden. It had found its stage. Brennan's face twisted with desperation. "Stay out of it," he barked at Darren, spittle flying from his lips. "He's bluffing." "Contain him before." "Before what?" Adrian interrupted, raising his voice just enough. "Before I show everyone what you're hiding?" Before the scans go public, before the bruises on my son's jaw become your legacy? The hush that followed wasn't silence, it was weight, judgment, awareness. Adrian stepped forward, the flickering lights briefly illuminating his face in gold and shadow. He held Noah closer, pressing his hand gently over the boy's back as the infant whimpered softly against his shoulder. Darren took a single step back. "You can't hide behind turbulence forever," Adrian said coldly, his voice like tempered steel. "It clears eventually and leaves the sky cleaner. Passengers, please return to your seats." The pilot's voice broke through the rattling cabin like a threadbare patch over a growing tear. But no one moved. The command held no weight now, not after what had unfolded. The authority in that voice rang hollow, more scripted than sincere. The passengers knew it. Adrian knew it. Most of all, the contractor knew it. Seated near the forward galley, the contractor subtly lowered his hand from the seat's embedded communicator. The earpiece he wore buzzed faintly as he muttered coded phrases too softly to hear. But Adrian caught just enough. The rhythm, the cadence, the tension in the man's posture. That wasn't a check-in. It was a directive, and that meant the cockpit was compromised. Adrian's jaw tightened. If the pilots were no longer acting on behalf of the airline, then their destination might not be Ralden International as planned. ARV had its own strips, isolated, private, secured with off-grid tech. If they landed there, Adrian and Noah would vanish beneath layers of legal fabrications. The world would never know. He scanned the cabin swiftly, absorbing details like a floodlight turned inward. Then he saw him, a man perhaps in his late 60s, his face weathered but alert, seated 2 rows behind in an aisle seat. A single brass pin shimmered on his navy blue lapel. It bore the insignia of the Federal Air Defense Corps. A service pin. Retired but trained. A man who had once flown above storms, not beneath them. Adrian rose halfway and leaned across the aisle, voice low, urgent but measured. "Captain Corin." The man turned, eyes narrowing beneath a pair of silver-rimmed glasses. "You know who I am." Adrian nodded. "I know what that pin means." "I need your help." Corin studied him briefly, then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Adrian leaned in, keeping Noah cradled close with one arm, his other hand gesturing subtly toward the Vale brothers. "They're trying to reroute the flight. I believe the pilots are compromised. I've secured proof, broadcast ready. But I need cockpit access and time to transmit." Corin's brow creased slightly, but his hands remained still on his knees. ARV? Adrian's eyes flicked toward the metallic briefcase still nestled beneath Brennan Vale's seat. And more. This wasn't just assault. This was engineered. If we don't act before they descend, we lose jurisdiction, and my son loses justice. Corin exhaled slowly, then nodded again. "We isolate the Vales, draw attention forward. You need the cockpit?" 30 seconds with the emergency terminal, Adrian said. "Can you buy me that?" "I'll need a distraction. Something dramatic, but credible." "I can give you one," Adrian replied, glancing toward Darren Vale. Adrian moved back to his seat, setting Noah gently down in the bassinet beside him, then turned to face Darren. The younger Vale was pretending to check the cabin pressure stats on a crew tablet, but his eyes betrayed the crack forming in his armor. He was no longer sure which side he stood on. "You were told I was dangerous, weren't you?" Adrian asked quietly. Darren blinked. "I'm not supposed to. They said I had tech you needed to secure, that it was for containment, that I might resist, that I was a threat." Darren shifted his weight uncomfortably. "It was protocol." Adrian's voice lowered, but its precision sharpened like a scalpel. "What they didn't tell you is that your brother elbowed a child to bait his father. They didn't tell you I'd already reported ARV for attempting to buy classified prototypes. They didn't tell you your signature is now part of a live broadcast tagging you to a hijacking." Darren froze. Adrian's eyes softened just a little. You can stop being their tool, Darren. Or you can go down as a man who ignored a child's scream. A tremble passed through Darren's hands. The tablet dipped in his grasp. He said, "It would be routine. That we'd just delay you. Scan the ring. Nobody would get hurt." Adrian gently pointed to the pacifier in Noah's hand, still cracked down the middle. "Someone already did." Behind them, Brennan's voice rose sharply. "What's he telling you?" "Stay focused, Darren." But the younger Vale didn't respond. His lips parted, the muscles in his jaw twitching as if fighting to speak. Adrian leaned closer, voice barely a breath. "If you ever had a conscience, this is your one chance to prove it." Darren looked up, and in that split second, Adrian saw it. The break. The flicker of humanity fighting its way through the chain of orders. Behind them, Brennan's fingers drummed nervously on the armrest. His confidence had begun to slip. He sensed the ground shifting beneath him, but he didn't yet understand how quickly the fault lines were spreading. Captain Corrin stood near the galley, suddenly clutching his chest and gasping loudly. "Medic!" someone shouted. Passengers turned as Corrin slumped forward, collapsing against the wall. A young man jumped from his seat, rushing forward while Darren instinctively moved to activate the crew intercom. In that chaotic moment, Adrian caught Brennan glancing toward the cockpit. His mouth twitched. A silent cue. A code, perhaps. Adrian's voice slid like ice behind Brennan's ear. "A man can fake authority," he said, watching Brennan's eyes widen. "But not truth." Darren stepped aside. His voice was a whisper, sharp and low, barely audible beneath the cabin's mechanical hum. "The cockpit, they changed coordinates." The words dropped like a blade into Adrian's ear. There was no time to question, no time to second guess. Adrian's eyes met Darren's for a brief second, not with forgiveness, but recognition. Then he turned. With Noah secure in his arm, Adrian lunged forward just as the contractor moved. The man reached for him with practiced aggression, hand grazing the concealed device at his side. Adrian ducked beneath the reach, his shoulder grazing the edge of a seat as he barreled down the aisle. Corrin, alert and already in motion, blocked the contractor's second attempt, shoving him against a bulkhead with unexpected strength for a man his age. Ahead, the cockpit door began to slide shut, reinforced, nearly sealed. But Adrian didn't slow. He grabbed the nearest service cart, spun it on its wheels, and rammed it into the narrowing gap. The door slammed onto metal with a harsh metallic clang, jamming just before it could lock. Adrian forced his way through the crack, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the co-pilot jerked his head up, startled. The pilot's hand hovered over the console, eyes wide with confusion, and something else. Fear. Adrian raised his left hand, his smart ring glowing faintly. "Override ARV link," he said coldly, "or this plane won't land." His voice was calm, deadly in its precision. Corrin appeared at his shoulder moments later, taking command with a steely presence honed over years. "Manual control now," he ordered. The pilot hesitated, then moved. The controls lit up as Corrin flipped a sequence of switches. The aircraft lurched slightly as it broke from the covert override path and realigned with its proper trajectory. The new course flickered across the navigation screen. Ralden International, not the private ARV airstrip buried in remote territory. The plane's hum changed, steadier now, almost defiant. Suddenly, the cockpit door burst open behind them. Brennan Vale shoved his way through, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. "You're making a mistake," he screamed, voice cracking under pressure. Adrian turned, his body blocking the path between Brennan and the co-pilot. His eyes were like tempered steel, emotionless yet volcanic beneath. "The mistake," he said, voice low and unmistakably final, "was thinking my silence was consent." He slammed his hand down onto the emergency broadcast switch. The cockpit lights dimmed as the overhead screen behind the flight crew began to flicker. Across hundreds, perhaps thousands, of aviation monitoring channels, the real-time footage of the cabin surged to life. Passengers watching, Brennan's elbow, Noah's cry, the shattered pacifier, Darren's refusal of aid, the metallic case with the ARV insignia, the contractor's attack, all of it. It wasn't just evidence, it was exposure. Back in the cabin, passengers gasped, some covering their mouths, others holding up their phones to record what was now being broadcast on the seatback screens. Crew members froze, unsure if they were still part of a plane or now part of a reckoning. Brennan let out a guttural yell and lunged for Adrian, fury replacing reason. But before he could close the gap, Corin moved again, grabbing him in a hold that pinned him against the bulkhead. His years of military flight training translated into swift, efficient control. Brennan thrashed, his arms flailing, his voice incoherent. But he wasn't getting loose. "You picked the wrong plane," Corin muttered into his ear, tightening his grip. Adrian looked down at his son, still asleep, jaw still bruised but peaceful at last, and took a slow, quiet breath. Then he turned back to the cockpit panel, ensuring the transmission stayed active and uninterrupted. The red light blinked in rhythmic defiance. "It's over," Adrian whispered, as much to himself as to the men around him. And then, just as he reached to power down the relay, his ring pulsed once. A single encrypted ping, a reply. The screen flashed faint green, not from the aircraft, but from a secure ARV server. Somewhere, someone had received the signal and responded. The storm had only cleared above the clouds. The wheels screeched against the tarmac with a jarring finality as Flight Marin 842 touched down at Ralden International under emergency clearance. Blue and red lights flashed against the fogged windows, casting surreal hues over the weary passengers. The engines whined down like a sigh of relief or a warning of what was to come. Adrian Corr didn't wait for permission. As soon as the seatbelt light blinked off, he unfastened Noah's carrier and stood, shielding his son from the sudden movement of other passengers scrambling for answers and belongings. The boy stirred in his arms, jaw bruised and cheeks damp from earlier pain, but resting now, fragile and quiet. Adrian's hand gripped the carrier's handle like a vice, not out of fear, but resolve. Outside, the tarmac was alive with urgency. Federal investigators and windbreakers moved in formation, their eyes sharp, briefcases in hand, radios clipped to their shoulders. The jet bridge connected with a hollow thud. A rush of cold air swept into the cabin. "Dr. Corr," one of the agents called as they stepped aboard. His voice was clipped, formal. Adrian gave a slight nod, stepping forward but angling Noah away from the press of cameras already peering through the windows. As he exited, passengers whispered his name, some in awe, some in confusion, many still trying to understand what had unfolded in midair. Down the stairs, a waiting paramedic team greeted him with gurneys and medical kits. One of them, a younger man with steady hands and gentle eyes, reached for Noah. "May I?" he asked softly. Adrian hesitated only a moment, then transferred his son into the medic's arms. His jaw. Possible fracture. Minimal response to touch on the right side. His voice was clinical, but his eyes remained fixed on Noah until the medic nodded and turned toward the ambulance. Behind them, handcuffs clicked into place. Brennan Vale, eyes wild, shirt wrinkled, and tie askew, was dragged down the steps by 2 federal officers. "This is theft," he shouted, face red with fury. "That man stole corporate property, my briefcase, my case. This isn't over." Adrian didn't even look at him. Darren Vale followed next, walking slowly. He was not in cuffs. Not yet. His steps dragged like someone aging with each footfall. At the bottom of the ramp, he stopped just a few feet from Adrian. "I didn't know," Darren muttered, eyes hollow. "They told me it was a safety operation. That you were unstable. A security risk." Adrian turned to face him fully for the first time since the confrontation. The expression on his face was unreadable. Part fatigue, part sadness, part something colder. He studied Darren like a man reviewing a failed system schematic. "You believed them," he said finally, voice steady, "because it was easier than questioning the structure that signs your paycheck." Darren's throat bobbed with a swallowed apology that never made it out. The silence that followed was not hostile. It was heavier than that. It was a verdict of its own. A group of federal agents approached with stern expressions, but before they could begin their barrage of questions, Adrian held out a small metallic flash drive between his fingers. "Everything's here," he said, pressing it into the lead investigator's hand. "Timestamps, biometric logs, cabin footage, scanner interference, encrypted handoff signals. All of it." The agent looked at the drive, then back at Adrian. "We'll need a full statement." "You'll have it," Adrian replied, his gaze shifting momentarily toward the ambulance as it pulled away. "But understand this. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for accountability." In the background, reporters surged toward the scene like crows to a signal flare. Cameras flashed, microphones extended on long poles. A man shouted, "Dr. Kaur!" "Are you pressing charges?" Another called out, "Is it true ARV Systems tried to extract proprietary data?" Adrian said nothing. The moment didn't belong to them. The cameras found Brennan, still shouting, still resisting the reality around him. "You think this ends here? That baby was just your shield. You'll regret this. Your whole company will." Adrian turned, lifting his hand to block the blinding lights. He could feel the heat of the press, the noise of their questions, but all of it faded into the background as he reached up to gently shield Noah's eyes from the glare. "No more darkness, son," he murmured, walking past microphones and cameras. "Truth already has wings." The trial chamber buzzed with a quiet tension, as though the very air held its breath. The prosecutor's voice cut through it like a blade. "Your Honor, Exhibit 47. Recovered server transmissions linking Brennan Vale to the ARV extraction protocol." Every screen in the courtroom lit up with grainy yet unmistakable footage. Brennan whispering to Darren mid-flight, the metallic case with the ARV Systems insignia flickering under the cabin lights, the contractor's concealed device. Gasps echoed across the gallery. The defense shifted uncomfortably. Even Brennan's smug expression had faltered. Brennan's lawyer rose. "We don't dispute the footage," he said, trying to sound composed, "but my client's response was instinctive, turbulence-induced reflexes, not malice." His voice lacked conviction. "We contend that Mr. Vale did not recognize the potential danger of his actions under high-stress conditions. This was not calculated, but the jury had already seen too much. They had watched the video in full, Adrian calmly shielding his child, the bruised jaw, the calculated containment, and, most damning of all, the moment Brennan opened the encrypted case and gave a subtle nod to the contractor. Instinct didn't smuggle biometric theft devices aboard commercial aircraft. Adrian sat beside his attorney, hands folded tightly in his lap, the courtroom lights reflecting softly against the brushed metal of his smart ring. His face betrayed nothing. He hadn't spoken publicly since the incident, hadn't given interviews or press statements. His silence had only made the world listen harder. Reporters had called him many things, engineer, father, survivor, but today, in this room, he was the fulcrum on which justice balanced. Then came the witness everyone had been waiting for. Darren Vale entered the chamber with slow, hesitant steps. The younger brother looked smaller now, as though the weight of conscience had finally begun to settle on his shoulders. He took the stand, cleared his throat, and refused the defense's offer to plead the fifth. "I need to speak," he said, voice wavering but determined. "They told us to provoke him." Adrian Kaur. The goal was to create an incident that would legally justify detaining him during the flight. Once restrained, the contractor would extract the biometric data from his ring using a reader disguised as a tranquilizer. A murmur rippled through the room. "They told me it was a matter of national security," Darren continued, voice trembling. "But it wasn't." It was a corporate theft. Brennan was the inside asset. ARV Systems funded the operation. I didn't know everything, but I knew enough, and I didn't stop it. The prosecutor stepped forward. And what was the purpose of the data? Darren hesitated, then spoke. To reverse engineer Adrian's compression algorithms. They planned to present it as a breakthrough in aerospace material engineering, under ARV's name. Adrian finally looked up. Their eyes met. In that moment, Darren wasn't just a betrayer. He was a mirror of what happened when good men stayed silent too long. The courtroom sat frozen in that silence. When Judge Harlan entered for closing remarks, he carried the verdict with solemn clarity. He gestured for Brennan to rise. "Mr. Vale," he said, voice heavy with gravity, "you assaulted a child to bait a father. You attempted to hijack not only a man's body but his mind, his legacy, his invention. Your defense, if it can be called that, hinges on turbulence and timing. But turbulence does not forge forged signatures. It does not fabricate encryption handoffs. This court finds you guilty of corporate conspiracy, assault of a minor, and attempted intellectual theft. The sentence, 10 years in federal prison." Brennan's face twisted, not in regret, but disbelief. He had been so certain his wealth, his ties, and his fabricated version of the truth would shield him. Now, even the cameras didn't look at him. They turned instead toward Adrian. The judge turned his gaze to the gallery. "ARV Systems," he said, "by order of this court and the Federal Commerce and Aviation Ethics Committee, is hereby sanctioned and ordered into liquidation. Its licenses are revoked, its board investigated, its assets frozen pending restitution reviews. When innovation is punished and innocence attacked, society falls from its own altitude." The words struck like thunder. As the courtroom emptied, a reporter approached Adrian just outside the heavy wooden doors. The cameras flashed wildly, eager to capture his reaction. "How does it feel to win?" the reporter asked. Adrian adjusted Noah's blanket in his arms, the child now fully healed but nestled quietly against his father's chest. Adrian glanced past the reporters to the courthouse steps, where sunlight pierced between the pillars like truth slipping through bureaucracy. "I didn't win," he said quietly, without bitterness. He looked down at Noah and smiled gently. "My son did." The world began calling him the engineer who grounded corruption midair. Justice had finally learned to fly. Sunlight reflected off the glass facade of the Horizon Ethics Foundation, scattering gold across the marble floor where Adrian Corr stood addressing the crowd. The air inside hummed with quiet reverence. Camera shutters clicked softly, journalists scribbled, and a dozen students stared at the gleaming displays that told the story of a flight that had changed everything. Behind Adrian, a suspended model of Flight Marin 842 hung from invisible wires, its polished fuselage glinting under the lights. Below it, the cracked pacifier encased in glass caught every eye, a symbol of both pain and perseverance. "The Foundation's purpose," Adrian began, his tone steady but lined with quiet weight, "is not to relive what happened, but to ensure no one ever calls it normal again." His reflection wavered in the glass as he spoke, sunlight washing his features with the same warmth he had once feared he'd never feel again. From the front row, Captain Hal Corrin stood at attention, his uniform jacket pressed sharp, eyes gleaming with pride. Darren Vale, thinner now, sat beside him in a volunteer's plain gray vest. The two men who had once stood on opposite sides of morality were now bound by shared redemption. After the ceremony, a journalist approached with a recorder trembling slightly in his hand. "Dr. Corr," he asked, "do you ever think about that night?" The question cut through the hum of conversation. Adrian exhaled slowly, fingers brushing the glass over Noah's pacifier. "Every day," he said, but not with anger anymore. With purpose, his gaze drifted to the etched flight data beside it, the numbers that once dictated terror now preserved as testimony. In another part of the hall, a child pressed his face against the glass, pointing at a diagram of a plane's internal structure. "Daddy, that's the one that broke?" the boy asked. His father, a maintenance technician, nodded solemnly. "Yes, but because of that, we learned how not to break again." Adrian overheard them, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The ache that had once consumed him had become a quiet fire guiding his every step. Later that afternoon, Adrian led a small tour of the research wing. The group passed through rooms filled with prototypes, cockpit empathy simulators, real-time passenger monitoring systems, and AI ethics displays, all born from the principles that tragedy had ignited. "Every mechanism here," he explained, "exists because someone ignored humanity when they shouldn't have. Machines don't make moral choices. People do." Corin nodded approvingly. "And sometimes," he added, "people learn." Darren approached as the group dispersed, his voice hesitant. "I've been cataloging the footage again," he said quietly. "Each time, I see more than my mistakes. I see what you built after them." His hands trembled as he spoke, the guilt still living under his skin. Adrian regarded him for a long moment, then placed a hand on his shoulder. "We can't erase consequence," he said gently, echoing his earlier words. "But we can redefine purpose." Darren's eyes glistened, relief mixing with sorrow. "Then I'll keep rebuilding, one truth at a time." As the crowd thinned, Adrian lifted Noah into his arms. The boy giggled, his healed jaw barely bearing the faintest scar. Together they walked toward the tall glass windows where the horizon blazed orange with the coming sunset. A commercial plane crossed the sky, gliding smooth and unbroken through the fading light. Adrian pointed upward. "You see that?" he whispered. Noah followed his finger, eyes wide with wonder. "Every storm ends," Adrian said softly, "but the lesson stays above the clouds." Behind them, the Foundation's motto shimmered on a silver plaque, catching the dying light. "Dignity is not turbulence. It's the way we land after it." The cameras faded, the voices quieted, and for a moment the world seemed perfectly still, resting on the balance between pain remembered and peace earned. In that silence, history itself seemed to breathe, carrying the weight of all they had endured into a new, lighter sky. The world had finally learned that some accidents are not accidents at all. They're turning points in disguise. He mocked a family and froze when the father rose, calm and commanding as every eye turned. If you believe dignity is the loudest form of power, subscribe now, because justice speaks without raising its voice. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, disrespect, and the moment dignity and truth overpower ignorance. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage reflection on equality, accountability, and treating every person with humanity.